Hi, I'm Danny Black, and welcome to the @SportsBalt podcast. On this podcast, I will be talking sports cards, collectibles, memorabilia. I'll be interviewing hobby guests. I will be talking about my own thoughts. I'll cover regular sports that relate to the hobby. That's the fun part. More importantly, I want you along for the ride. So click like and follow for more content, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, hello. Welcome back to another episode of the SportsBalt podcast. I'm still Danny Black, and tonight I get to do one of those episodes, which is the reason I have my own show. I saw that everybody in the hobby was able to read an Instagram post and was talking about the annual GemRate report, and I find it very cool, and I find it cool all year. So I'm going to use the annual report as an excuse just really to talk about all that GemRate provides. In general, in the hobby right now, I'm going to skip mailbag today. We'll hit that probably tomorrow on a short one. And this is going to air in the next couple of days. So look for new episodes of Hobby Think Tank, Card Menches. And Saturday, I am hosting Hobby Hotline, I believe, as well. So with all that being said, I would like to welcome in to the SportsBalt podcast, Ryan from GemRate. Ryan, welcome in.
Danny, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
No, thank you, buddy. I appreciate people in this hobby that are as nerdy as I am and wear it proudly. I think the people that watch will agree. So I'm going to skip all the normal stuff. GemRate, you started it with the name GemRate very specifically, is you were rating gems. I know that sounds silly to people, but can you talk about the actual original goal of what GemRate was?
Yeah, that I wanted to carve out just a niche in the hobby where it was sort of, I was definitely thinking about a problem I wanted to solve around where should I send my cards to get graded. And, I was doing a lot of ultra modern stuff, and I'm always sort of thinking about just, what are my odds of sort of getting a gem? And so I was just thinking, GemRate could be a cool name or easy name at least, and one that is sort of common language in the hobby. And so I just focused on that. And I also knew I didn't want to just, when I was starting to look at this data, just sort of publish, the same things that everybody else was publishing on their own individual pop reports. So I didn't want to exactly be redundant with the graders. And so I just wanted to carve out something a little bit more specific to, what percentage of cards are getting that gem mint grade, which has been great for ultra modern, but it does do a disservice to some elements of the hobby for sure. Right. If for the vintage segment, for example, people have always asked if I could unveil the full set of grades, which I have. I just haven't really figured out exactly how to visualize it and things like that. But yeah, that was sort of the goal, was just to give people a quick sense for, how do certain cards grade relative to others. And it's a lot of data. So by just narrowing it down to that gem mint percent, it was very feasible and sort of digestible.
Was the original hypothesis based upon the fact that it was the card company that was the biggest variable as opposed to the production of the set?
I thought it was both, so for example, I was very big into the ultra modern basketball when I got back into the hobby in 2020. And, there were just certain parallels, for example, that it seemed like they were grading out really poorly. And I didn't know if that was just by, I figured it was manufacturing quality, but I didn't necessarily know why. And I didn't know if it trended the same over years. And so I really wanted to look at this data in aggregate. Like a pop report's great to look at a specific card, but I found myself just copying data, off of the websites into Excel, and it was really painful. And I was trying to think about how could I group together, all parallels of a certain type and compare them to other parallels, and just understand like if that's a parallel wide trend, and get a better sense for like what that looked like over years. But it was definitely both. I didn't know if it was sort of like, that specific point was more towards the manufacturers and understand like where were there just defects that might be leading to some mispricing in the market. But also, yeah, they're just, broadly speaking, you definitely, after, 2 years of looking at this data, you definitely see that it's also grading company specific too.
Well, and that's why I was wondering if the hypothesis changed from the original idea of comparing who to send your card to versus now you have to take into consideration the chances that no matter who you send it to, that set tends to gem at a lower percentage. Mm-hmm. So I am fascinated by the actual percent of cards that gem. And can you define what you use on your site as the term gem?
Yeah, so I probably should discloses more often, but it's anything that's gem mint or greater, which is, still it's a small portion of cards that are going to be higher than gem mint at all these companies. But yeah, and it's so specific to each company, and it's, using their own scale. So that way I'm comparing, the highest, gem mint card for all companies. So it's as close to apples as I can get, essentially.
So are we talking PSA 10s, BGS 9.5
Yep.
and higher,
Yep.
SGC 9.5 and higher,
SGC 10,
SGC 10,
Yep.
and CSG redid theirs.
Yep, they're at 10 now as well. But when they were 9.5 when I initially started looking at the data, and then they switched it over.
And what does CGC use? I'm not a trading card.
I think off the top of my head, I'm 99% sure they use the 9.5 as their.
My son
they do.
Is a diehard Pokemon fan, and if he was in the next room, I think I would have just lost a child. We've done enough shows that I should know that backwards and forwards. So I apologize to my son somewhere.
Yeah, me as well, because I look at this data all day and I knew that, but I'm like, I second guess myself. I'm pretty sure it's 9.5, which it is, but it's just, I get confused all the time. You can jump in all these companies.
Oh, it's so funny. I get on air and I can forget my own kids' names, much less. Yeah. So, okay. So the original hypothesis is there are certain cards that are going to get better grades, theoretically, based upon production, based upon the grading company. And this is all rolling out at a time where the hobby's booming. And one thing about hobby consumers, collectors, is we have no patience. And we have no margin of error that we give. So how quickly did this explode, and how quickly did you realize the expectations were going to be well beyond what you could initially provide?
It was a little bit. So, I mean, honestly, it was definitely an investment, and I just wanted to get the data right. Like I'm such a big believer in, it takes a while to build trust and it's easy to lose it. And so I wanted to make sure the data was right. And so I spent, a lot of months just sort of behind the scenes building out infrastructure. I wanted to make sure I could capture the data, understand the data, process the data, and publish it on sort of on some sort of regular cadence. So behind the scenes, it took 4 to 5 months before I even sort of went public with it, and then it was well received. The first 2 months I published it basically into the dark. Nobody was reading it. I would occasionally get 5. You could probably look at the initial post. There might be 10 likes on it. It would, but I did get a couple posts likes from people like Chris Hoge and stuff like that, who are big data junkies in the space. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Like the people, at least that, I'd hope would see this, are seeing it. And then I got a couple features. Card Porn featured it when it was kind of, that was when people were like, oh, wow, somebody's finally taking a stab at sort of like helping us understand, what is even happening in the grading landscape, which is what I wanted to provide, was just like a macro view. You really, everybody has an opinion in this hobby, but it's not, it's very subjective, and, it's not always backed by data. And I wanted to just, I wasn't stating any opinions or sort of, trying to sort of, dictate any of the terms of the conversation. I just wanted to put data out there and let people sort of run with it. And it was really well received. It was just, I think first and foremost, it was the first time people were able to react and say, wow, okay, I didn't realize that's what's happening. At the time, PSA was in the thick of sort of the backlog, and, the amount of, 1990 Flair Michael Jordans that were being pumped through the system at the time were just kind of like mind blowing. So anyways, yeah, it was really well received. And it's definitely been one of those things where, there's still a lot of unanswered questions that the data, has the opportunity to sort of shed some light on. But for the most part, I've been focused on more of this macro, onboarding other graders, data sets into this, so we could paint the full picture of not just what PSA was doing, but also what does it look like through the lens of, the Beckett's of the world, the SGCs, the CSGs, and CGCs of the world. So that's definitely been sort of 2021 was more about like what's going on with PSA, and 2022 was more about like what's going on across the broader landscape. And I think those themes have really resonated, and just trying to add some more depth and sort of dimensions to the data around, gem rates by era, and sort of just like giving people a sense for, again, like what's going in and out of these companies' doors, who has momentum, where, who is sort of, whatever, losing momentum. You definitely see like people, there's a lot of variation between the graders, and, people are thoughtful about where they submit their cards. People are pretty loyal, or historically have been pretty loyal. And you definitely see like certain things that, hold true over time. But then you see certain fluctuations, especially like in the ultra modern space, depending on, who's open and what they're grading and what the pricing, landscape looks like at that time. So it's been really interesting for me. It's been pretty eye opening just to understand, just how I don't know, just in general, like how many cards are getting pumped through the system is pretty wild. And it's definitely been really interesting to think about again, like where do these land? And I think that was the big question when PSA was working through their backlog last year and in 2021. And now, on the TCG side, the trading card game side of things, they're kind of in their own little mini hype cycle right now. There's a lot of cards going through on that side. And I'm very interested to see like, just is that market more robust? Is there sort of more potential for that market, or are they lagging what we saw in sports cards right now? But anyways, it's been really interesting.
Well, one of the things that I think is fascinating is the fact that you have kind of included the trading card games. And I know some of that is because some companies split them easier, some don't. And so it is a little bit of a mishmash because it grew so fast. And by the way, mishmash is a technical term. I've been doing this 30 years. Just follow along. So I'm going to make a couple predictions for the theory behind GemRate for 2023. Okay, and tell me your thoughts. One, the idea that we all want a universal registry remains a far off concept that we may never see in our lifetime, and we could settle at another planet before we get a universal registry. Number two, I believe that ticket populations are going to start becoming almost as common as card populations. I'm curious for your feedback on that. And number three, the data, I call it the data wars of the last 18, 24 months in the hobby is going to see consolidation, mergers, acquisitions, and the quality of access to data will just improve as a general comment, because I think you have a lot of smart people aimed at that right now. So those are just kind of three of my overview thoughts going into this year. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think so on the registry side of things, it's very interesting. I mean, oh man, the registry is one of the things that I didn't even know existed when I got back into the hobby, and then I quickly learned about it, and I was sort of fascinated by just like how much
people care.
Well, it was really interesting to see how much the sort of the newer or sort of the reemerging hobbyists were not paying attention to it, but like how much people would go to bat for the PSA registry and what it meant to them, and how it sort of impacted pricing and all these other sort of theories behind it. But it didn't touch any of sort of the people who had come in and sort of got excited about sports cards back in 2020. Yeah, and so I started to try to understand it more, and I'm still sort of trying to just wrap my head around like what is happening in that world, how how deep does it run, and because I do think it's interesting. We could touch on this maybe later, but one of the most important things I sort of ask in the space is like, let's assume that pricing sort of becomes less of a factor, like everybody kind of gets to their bottom or what's sort of manageable for them to be sustain a business and hopefully be
profitable. You're talking about the cost of grading.
Yeah, the cost of grading, exactly. If we sort of assume that everybody gets to their sort of like best price, how do companies differentiate? And so, PSA already has the set registry, but, there's been talk of whether or not SGC could launch one. BGS has had one in some way, shape, or form over the years. CSG has their own. But anyways, how do these companies differentiate themselves over time? And, set registry is really interesting, and it may end up looking different. I don't know, or maybe people have a different way of rethinking what that means. But I just think it's really important to think about like, how do you add value beyond just sort of the idea of, encasing this card and multiplying the value of it and increasing the resale value of it. And the set registry is one answer to that question, but like what else will these companies think of doing to sort of facilitate just adding more value to the process, whether that's community side of it, whether that's showcasing side of it. And so the set registry is definitely like one element of that. But yeah, the universal side of it, I think is really interesting. Definitely have been asked a lot of questions about that. I am currently and very actively now working on the universal pop report. So not the registry, but the pop report. So if you want to understand, a set across all graders, or you want to understand a card across all graders, that's something that will be released in phases over this year. And that's mostly why the website still looks the same for GemRate as it did a year ago, as I've been working on the data modeling almost all of 2022 to sort of produce that product, which I'm really excited about.
I've told people Google hasn't changed their homepage much, and it hasn't seemed to stop their business. So I think it's more what's in the engine than anything else, and people seem to like that engine. So don't worry about that.
That's very fair. But theirs is at least set up to let you immediately do what you want to achieve there. And you get a lot of questions about like, what does GemRate do again when you land on our site? But
all right, so you're not quite Googled today, but but in all seriousness, so the Universal Registry, I've been on this forever. I've given up any hope, so that's not going to happen. But as far as I guess moving forward, kind of your thoughts on 2023 as far as the data and grading reporting, how that landscape looks.
Yeah, in general, I think the data side is interesting. I think pricing has been where everybody focused their attention early on. So I think there's some good data tooling there. The question in a lot of ways is just like, to what degree are people willing to pay for that? And, how large is that market, which I think is important. It's one of the reasons that or one of the inputs that I used when I was thinking about like, how do we build a business around GemRate? I do think one of the things that's been great, and I think that GemRate has helped build some momentum behind, I'd like to think, is that like transparency has been something that's sort of been overlooked in this hobby. And, the idea of, hey, if GemRate's publishing this data, why don't we just, publish our own data and sort of either, complement what's already happening there or get ahead of it, or publish data that's sort of just different. For example, at one point, PSA was starting to publish the same thing that I was publishing, but they were just doing it 2 weeks after I was doing it. Instead, they said, well, that's not really the goal here. If Ryan's getting close enough and GemRate's sort of painting a decent enough picture, why don't we do what submissions look like instead, which has been great. Like, I love that data.
You've also always presented the data from the beginning, just kind of here it is without a slant to it.
Yep. Yeah, I try not to be opinionated at all. I like to ask questions and sort of challenge, just like, hey, what's happening? What could we be thinking about here? Or what might be going on? But I don't really have an opinion, and I try to stay pretty unbiased, or at least as unbiased as I can be in the process. But yeah, and then, you're seeing some of the grading companies, Beckett's been pretty closed with their data. They've now started to remove some of the CAPTCHAs and some of the, things that just made the user experience really challenging because they were trying to protect the data or logging in, all these things that sort of were important to them back in the day, but less so now. And, if the idea that, at least my thinking is that better data sort of leads to more confidence, and more confidence will lead to more transactions, and sort of a improved hobby landscape over the long run, where just more people are willing to participate, and sort of the barriers to entry sort of shrink. And so you're starting to see people become more open with their data, which is exciting because, the reality is there's a lot of great data out there that's just underutilized, partially because they've been just closed off. And so I think that from a data standpoint, you're definitely seeing more data become accessible. PSA has spoken to releasing some more data via APIs and things like that too. So I think you'll see more tooling emerge too. Like, we're just one angle on the data. I think there's a lot of things that we're not doing yet that I'm excited to do, but I'd like to think that there's some more opportunities there, but there also might be consolidation. For example, the pricing world where everybody's been focusing on it, maybe there needs to just be some consolidation on that side. I don't even know what might happen there, but other opportunities with data certainly will sort of emerge, I think, in the future here.
One of the things that you brought up was what can create added value for one grading company versus another. And I'm a big believer in, we're watching it literally grow before our eyes, are these separate ecosystems, where it includes some form of a marketplace, some form of a vault, some form of pricing or data. And you're seeing the collectors, Universe Collectors, has that. I think you're seeing the PWCC partnerships. I think you're seeing eBay partnerships. And I think you're seeing, when I talk about some of these consolidations, I think you're almost going to have separate ecosystems. And it's going to be very similar into choosing Android or iPhone. Mm-hmm. In some ways, you're going to kind of commit to an ecosystem because it's going to be easier for all of your stuff to stay within an ecosystem.
Yep.
Does that, and actually, let me take a step back. you said full transparency. For full transparency, you and I both do some consulting, including we both consult with Center Stage, and we do work in the data world. So I just want to be upfront about that. And I love Center Stage and all the work John's doing over there. So I do want to say that out loud. But you and I both work with companies in this area, and it seems like it is a race to get the best quality data and get it into an ecosystem. Are you feeling similar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's super interesting, and I definitely think that's a tricky, piece to navigate, or tricky thing to navigate in this hobby, which is, there just tends to be a lot of skepticism. That sort of skepticism by default seems to be sort of the way this hobby operates. And so, I think that people want, I think as data sort of builds momentum and becomes more trusted, as just more people are sort of forward with it, or better tooling sort of emerges related to data. I think there's definitely a belief that like data can be trusted and sort of sort of like long-standing or established, and sort of something that even if it were to be acquired, isn't going to automatically sort of change its opinion and sort of be biased towards the acquisitor, and sort of lose sight of sort of like what its principles or values were when it was created. And I think that's a risk.
And I didn't mean to imply that it would be biased. So that's a very fair point. And actually, I should look at that from the other side: is would it be? But that's a very fair point.
Yeah, I think. Well, that's I think even when you saw Card Ladder get acquired last year or I guess that was at the end of 2021.
Time doesn't matter. We don't use that. Yeah.
When they were acquired by collectors, though, people were immediately like, of course, they're going to be, no longer looking at pricing for their slabs, and it's going to be oriented around PSA, and I think they've done a good job of holding the line there, and they definitely, when collectors acquired them, carved out space for them to do what they want, and I think that's important. Like that's they're considered one of the leading tools from a data standpoint in the industry, and I think that's important that they've been able to sort of like continue to build and not immediately sort of like change direction and have to sort of fit the larger PSA agenda, which I think is great. And so I definitely believe that the ecosystem thing is going to happen for sure. And I think it's interesting. I think that one of the things when you're talking about the data space too is like, and I've thought about this as we're building this universal pop report, and how to sort of just continue to build trust and belief behind the concept. Like, is there some sort of opportunity to have like a consortium between the graders that sort of everybody sort of mutually benefiting from, like, everybody contributes data, everybody sort of has an opportunity to participate with that data and make use of that data. And it's sort of an open ecosystem where everybody sort of has I don't know if it's an equal share or what exactly that looks like, but anyways, just more opportunities to partner. And that seems to be something that's sort of been off the table. So I definitely think there's a lot of creativity that could emerge. It's just a matter of like who sort of leads that charge. And I'm too small to sort of like lead that conversation in a lot of ways, but I definitely think there's some willingness and openness to start to be like, hey, we're all sort of doing the same stuff in silos. Maybe we can be a little bit more synergistic if we combine our data, or find pockets where we can work together that benefit the sort of the larger whole, and allow us all to participate.
I think, and I'm going to be blunt here and you can pass it over, everybody has incentive except PSA. I think if we're going to cut to the bottom line here on a lot of these universal ideas, everybody's got more incentive to work together than PSA, because right now PSA has the registry. And so from my perspective, the question is where does that value get created for collectors? And I don't know. I really don't. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that PSA has, if PSA was okay with the world staying the same size it is today, then I think that's fair. I think that they've raised money and sort of have this ambitions to grow, the pie. And so I think that if they think there's an opportunity to bring more people into the market, they'll be willing to sort of entertain that. I mean, I do think that there'll be some resistance for sure, because they just have such control and sort of, a dominant role in the market. But for example, if Fanatics were to push them and say, hey, we need more open data for this to work, I think that there's probably enough leverage on the Fanatics side to say, hey, we'll actually give you better data if you're willing to sort of provide better data to the hobby as a whole too. And so I think they're open to it for sure. I think the incentives have to be right. Everything's always sort of motivated by the incentives, absolutely. But I think that, a lot of these companies that raised money, raised at sort of the peak, and there's some obligation or some desire to be larger than where they are today, and not just keep things as sort of uh, status quo. So I think there will be some motivations to continue to sort of challenge how do we, you know, facilitate growth to people who have historically sort of not been able to participate. And if better data allows for that, then I do think somebody like a PSA will say, okay, we'll try some things out. Maybe we won't give everything away, but we'll sort of step into this and see if there's opportunities to get more people interested because better data exists.
I'm going to take a snapshot as of January 2023 on where I think kind of the hobby is in the data game. I think we're kind of in call it the second inning at best. And I'm going to put us that early in the game because I think pre-pandemic, the amount of data was pretty limited to maybe some auction results or eBay results and very little beyond that. I think in the pro column on where data's gotten better is one, you see companies like collectors taking an interest in acquiring a company like Card Ladder, like you said. You're seeing data companies that are genuinely interested in giving the end user, the consumer, the collector, accurate, like you said, to the best of the ability, accurate pricing, information, pop reports, even cert verifications I'm seeing integrated into a lot of sites now, which is kind of cool to not have to leave, your shopping app and just verify that the card is legit. I guess for me, though, there are flaws, and that's just because of where we are in technology and where we are in the amount of years that people have been trying to really work at this is pretty short in technological terms. But for me, the biggest couple issues in data right now, and I'd love your thoughts, is one, private versus public sales is still going to be one of those things that are a challenge to overcome. And I know there are companies that are fighting really hard to record private sales and find a way to track that. Fanatics is also a data company. And if I think a lot of Fanatics dealers with the Fanatics required software and purchase history, whether or not that is publicly available, some of that may get captured in card stores in the future. But for right now, I'll call that a gap in data. And one of the other ones also is resubmitting, cracking and resubmitting, throwing off pop reports. So I guess those are the two big ones that, as I was thinking quickly, and I'm sure I'm going to think of three more when we're done. But as far as the public versus private sales, your thoughts on that as being a challenge in data.
I mean, look, I think I'm very big on like the first principles and sort of like why people do what they do. And, like the private sales thing was really great when the market was moving up because people wanted to make sure that there was full information out there. And now when comps are, moving in the other direction, private sales are great to not have that comp published because people want to transact and not reset the floor. Right. And so
Great point.
And we're constantly resetting the floor. And that's one of the things people are now coming to the conclusion of. If everybody wants 80% of the last transaction, we're working our way towards zero every time there's a new transaction. And there's very few pockets where there's, dilution is like a thing that's very rarely talked about in this hobby. But like dilution is sort of what's sort of, in my mind, been one of the biggest problems over the last couple of years, which is especially for the modern, ultra modern cards, which is you have just a broad assortment of choices when it comes to like who to invest in and what cards to invest in. And even though the number of people and sort of the market cap of a player might be still the same as it was a couple of years ago, the prices are moving down because there's just more cards out there, and it doesn't look the same as cards that were out there a few years ago.
There was what, 500,000 Wander Francos?
Yeah, I don't even,
or something crazy for his base paper or something obscene.
Oh yeah. No, it's crazy how high it is within just one card, and then it's but Wander Franco himself has, he'll have 10,000 cards in the market, and it's just right. There's a lot of opportunities, and it'll make it look like prices are moving in the wrong direction when the reality is the Wander Franco market might actually be pretty strong. It's just being spread across more cards. So anyways, I think the private sales thing is interesting. I think that if the incentives are right, it makes a lot of sense, but you're going to have to create the right, reporting mechanisms for people to sort of, I don't know. I don't even know how you do it in a way that people don't cherry pick it. You're going to get people that cherry pick it when it's beneficial to them. And right now, there's not a real strong motivation for people to participate because it's just another data point to reset the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as the pop reports, is there any way to reasonably handle resubmissions and reflect that? Because as you know, certain cards come back with more higher pop reports than cards printed in the series or
Yeah.
in the run. So that, I mean, listen, this is not a knock on anybody. Good luck. Go get the best grade you can. You know, whatever you want to do, crack, resubmit to your heart's desire. But as far as a data standpoint, if I'm looking at a pop 4 and it's really, you know, was a pop 2, you know, because 2 were cracked, is there any way to deal with that realistically?
I don't. So I think I mean, I find it to be fascinating as well, and I think it's one of those things. As I'm doing this universal pop work, and I'm looking at just all these instances of cards that are serial numbered to 50 with pops of 75 across all the companies. And it's like, this is crazy, and it definitely, like, you can pinpoint it to certain players and certain just higher profile cards where people will submit the same card 10 times because it's worth it. They've done the math and they know if they just get that one time, it'll be worth it. I don't know, though, that unless you build the technology into the slab itself, and when you crack it, that sort of, kind of like pops it, like the ink exploding when you're
or fingerprint the card digitally.
Yeah. So I think, but I do think that, I know people scoff at sort of the concept of the blockchain and stuff like that, but I do think like provenance and things like that could sort of play into the future of this, the card hobby as well, which is just, I think there's super interesting stories around like who's owned cards and where cards were before they landed in certain people's laps. And it's just like, a lot of that stuff is not trackable today or sort of not understood. And so in general, I think like that story is really interesting. I think to the degree that it helps with this sort of truly understanding pop is important. So I'd like to think that they'll make some progress. It's like, it has to be there. The incentive has to be there. And I don't know that the ecosystem would appreciate enough to pay for something like that today. It is a pretty frugal hobby. And so, but I do think, now that people have more information, that'll help people start to ask harder questions of like, why are we letting these pop reports get out of control? And so I think if we can, challenge that, then I think the grading companies will have to sort of like, think about how do we resolve that. And so I do think there's opportunities to do it, but it's going to come through investment, R&D, technology. I don't think it's going to come from self-reporting, people sending in their certs. Like, that's never going to scale.
I agree. I think one of the challenges is if I go to a local card shop and I make an honest transaction and everybody has good intentions, nobody anywhere other than in that card shop when I did that deal knows what that transaction went for. And that's a lot of lost data. And as somebody who wants as much data as possible, because I want the largest sample size as possible, I don't know if it's, like I said, some sort of integration into Fnatic software that ultimately ends up in local card shops or whatever it is. But that to me would be one of the big untapped grounds of data.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think if Fanatics has a lot at stake to get this right, and I do think, to your point, they are a data company, and so I think they're going to put a lot of effort into building out that ecosystem, which hopefully again brings some leverage and sort of levels the playing field and puts more pressure on companies to just be more forward, or at least like willing to partner. And so but I don't know what the answer is, but definitely like it's a problem. I think it's it's one that people understand, and people will be like, well, pop reports are worthless. It's like, no, but you just have to understand what you're looking at and know that there are sort of manipulation through things like cracking and resubbing and things like that. But it's better than not having the data in most instances. And there's definitely ways that I think people, companies with the right incentives can address it. I don't know that we know what the answer is today, but I'd like to think that if we do look at this data and it does look problematic, that they'll address it.
One of the things about data, and I think it's similar to sabermetrics, is people who are presented the information in the wrong way kind of have a negative flinch or reaction to it. Data is the same stuff we talked about when I started as a dealer 30 years ago. I want rare cards. Or I want good condition cards that not a lot of people have. Mm-hmm. And so all the data is doing at this point is really just giving you more insight. It's another tool in your belt. It's not nobody's saying it's the only reason to buy or sell a card, but it is added information. And if you are in it and you do want to make smart decisions, you should use every tool at your disposal. That's kind of how I look at the pop reports. specifically, I guess.
Mhm.
Is that how you look at it?
100%. Yeah. None of these things are gospel or sort of, you can't, they're subject to interpretation and context for sure. And that's part of the reason, again, I'm sort of building out the universal because the landscape changes. If you looked at cards that were manufactured and released in 2013 through 2015, it's a very different story of where cards were graded versus cards that were manufactured in 2018 through 2021. And so, you need to be able to sort of see the big picture and ask questions of it. And without that, again, you're sort of you could be at a loss pretty quickly. And so yeah, but you can also understand, hey, okay, this doesn't make sense. I'll dismiss it, or I'll sort of consider, the context of what might be happening here. But yes, I very much of like you don't have to live by it, but you should certainly, at least know that it exists and consider it if it makes sense to you.
Absolutely. For those of you that are listening on the audio podcast, I'm going to try to talk through what I'm sharing here. I am, if I do this correctly, sharing off of GemRate. This is the top 100 cards all time graded by PSA by total volume of cards graded. Am I reading this correctly?
Yep.
Okay. Right. So what I love here, and the reason that I brought this up, and this is maybe just the baseball dork sports fan in me, is that 3 out of the top 4 are Ken Griffey Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And they're 1989. So obviously the Upper Deck. I mean, that was right in the wheelhouse of when I was doing shows. But it blows me away that the 89 tops traded Ken Griffey Jr. Is as popular and has been graded as many times as it has. So for people that are into this stuff, like going through some of these numbers and seeing what's on here is fascinating as a collector. One of the things that I also like to do is, and you can take this free commercial as I dork out here, but I like sorting by the GemRate percentage. And if I'm once again interpreting this correctly, it's the percentage of overall graded cards that have come back with a gem grade, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so is Pokemon just manufactured better than some other cards? Is that
Mm-hmm.
why it's so high?
Yeah, it grades a lot easier. It's a big reason why you see a lot of momentum with Pokemon at BGS as well, because people actually know they grade so well that they want a black label or a pristine. And so, but yes, they grade at a much higher rate.
And then it's not a surprise that most of this list is within the last 3 or 4 years, and a lot of that is production quality. I'm assuming, so we can.
Yeah. But that part you brought up right there is one of my favorite things that I never get to, which is like, for example, just what were cards? Well, one, I love the idea of like providing updates anytime like a new gem appears on the pop report. That's sort of like, has some significance, right? Just sort of tracker that's like, oh, new gems here, here, and here. That sort of rarely gets seen. So like one of the things we'll add to the site this year is sort of just like a last graded and a last gemmed metric. So you can see sort of just like have some more context around, because we track this data every day. We've been tracking it every day for 2 years. But another thing that I'm excited to do at some point is just allow people to have like more plug and play filters. Like what are cards that, instead of it just being the highest frequency graded cards over all time, it's, what are the highest frequency, and then allow you to have a filter with the lowest gem rates and say, what are cards that have been graded over 2,000 times but have a gem rate under 5%. And, you're obviously going to see a lot of vintage cards in there, but it'll give you sort of just a sort of a starting point to be like, oh, okay, I want rare cards and I want to understand.
You're stealing all my secrets of how I dig through your data right now on your site. That's exactly what to do. Yeah, that's awesome. You're coming out with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun, and I personally love it. And the more data that's out there, again, it just gives you more opportunities to sort of like carve out your angle. An angle in the sense of just like, what do you like to collect? It's not how do you make money, but just like, how do you find rare cards? And I think that's been my whole sort of thesis with this. Is just another, it's a very narrative driven hobby, and without the data, you can't really tell much of a story. And now this data allows you to sort of just say, hey, look, I feel pretty confident that this is a pretty rare card, and there's not a lot of sort of similar cards by comparison as it relates to the data that I'm looking at. And therefore maybe it's underappreciated, or at least it's like, for you, that's how you want to sort of, go to market with your, your collector profile and say, this is what sort of I stand for, sort of like what the data is, supporting me collecting. And sort of, again, it just like, there's a lot of different stories within it that we don't even surface at this stage.
One of the things that I love and one of my favorite stats is that the 89 Upper Deck Griffey, the star, the one I was referencing a second ago, has a 4% gem rate.
Mhm.
And how incredibly low that really is when you're talking about a lot of modern cards. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we're looking at the more modern cards being 50 to 60% gem rates and higher. And
Yeah, a lot of times.
yeah, and going back to the 80s, you're really looking at teens or 20, roughly.
Mhm.
So for an 89 Upper Deck to be a 4% gem rate, and it also to be the number one most submitted card, is like the greatest convergence of data in my head. I just love that. To me, that means if you grew up of a certain era and you have a certain amount of disposable income, go get a PSA 10 Griffey rookie. That is just going to be, I think, the mantle of another generation is the PSA 10.
Yeah,
Um,
it is. It's and then but the funnier thing too, we're not just another data point to that too is then to look at the BGS data, and it's like you can actually, that's where you start to think about, oh, maybe 9.5 is much more achievable there. Maybe it doesn't mean as much, but yeah, I mean it's 4% gem rate on that card is crazy, and that's where people start to get into pop control concepts and all these different things. And yeah, but I mean to have one of those 4,000 is pretty meaningful.
and like I said, it's weird because for like you said, vintage is almost a whole other beast when you look at grading. So for people of a generation that have grown up with modern cards, we're used to expecting nines and tens. I mean, at this point, most people don't want a card that's graded under a nine. Um, the fact that the most popular card of my lifetime almost never gems is fantastic. That gives me hope for the future. It really does. I don't want 20,000 tens out there.
Right.
Even 4,000 is a lot, but it's a small percentage. I guess scarcity is going to remain king. I think that's part of the end of this whole conversation is the ability to document it, the ability to use that information, and the fact that I think we all like to know how scarce and rare our stuff is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very very much uh like the appropriate way to think about it, and one that's sort of, I don't know, I came back into the hobby thinking that cards were pack fresh and like going to grade well, and I quickly learned that that's not the case. But it was funny because I was like, oh wow, but everybody's still buying all this wax thinking that they're going to be able to pull tens and grade them, and it's going to be a certainty. And the wax prices rose, and they still haven't really fully recalibrated for people realizing that no, actually the manufacturing, the quality control is really poor. And in some ways they're doing us a favor because there's just not going to be that many high quality cards that matter for some of these serial number cards that will ultimately be favorable, in favor years out. But yeah, I got caught up in that hoopla of just everything should be great quality, but then at the same time, it's like, well, if everything's great quality, then what are we doing here? And so I think it's just an interesting sort of concept. But I think that that's one of the things that sort of, as I sort of took a step back, I'm like, wow, wax prices really reflect quality being different than perception of better quality than it is. And ultimately, it'll probably be a good thing that you know, we're going through this period where they've been pumping out cards that are not of the highest quality, and that there'll just be some desirable cards if the grading ultimately still matters the same way as it does today, 10, 20 years from now. But it's definitely like an interesting um just exercise to think about you know what quality means and how does that sort of benefit us or hurt us in the long run.
And then you can go as far as you want with a tinfoil hat on who's controlling what, why, and how, and what that means for sales down the road. But
Yeah.
I'll leave my tinfoil hat slightly to the side today.
Well, I do
Yeah,
think, just really quick on that, I think it's very interesting. And like, I do think the thing that was overlooked last year that I was pretty confident, and I don't have any data to really support at this stage, but I think that it's really talked about, like, but the PSA guarantee I think matters when you're hiring a bunch of new graders, and they're going to round down when in doubt because they're going to be held to a different standard of more people are looking at these cards. They're now much more sort of aware of and thoughtful about what it means for a card to be in a grade that isn't representative of what the card actually looks like or should be graded, and what that means for them. And so I think like there's probably more accountability there. And ultimately, I think like even though it sort of looks like pop control, it's more just like they brought on a lot of new people who don't want to make a mistake of overgrading a card. That's a worse mistake than undergrading a card. And so I don't know that that's actually right, or that's just my theory, but I do feel like that's probably played a role in, certain cards that people sort of will throw on their tinfoil hat, grading out worse than people would expect over the long run. And I think it's partially just because you saw this sort of unusual dynamic of a lot of people brought in with sort of different standards, and so you did see inconsistency, which is important. Like, inconsistency is the thing you don't want to see with grading companies. I think people would be fine with different sort of standards of how people grade, but you sort of have to do your best to sort of stay the course and sort of hold to that standard.
I was about to say, we could do another hour on accuracy versus consistency and what that means. But no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I do believe in some weird way, you and other companies that are publishing some of this data put the pressure on the companies and the graders to say, oh, they know roughly how many 9s and 10s are out there. That number can't fluctuate too much or it'll be obvious. It's like the juice ball in Major League Baseball. So, I guess, Ryan, single-handedly, you've kept these young graders up at night, scared to death. That their percentages will be out of whack.
Yeah,
I can see some supervisor, waving your annual report in their face. No, just kidding. But you do a great service to the hobby. I've been a fan since you started, and I could go 3 hours, but at this point, people are going to start getting out of their car or turning me off because I'm not that interesting. But you are, and thank you for coming on. If you wouldn't mind hanging out in the green room with the blue Skittles for a second while I say goodbye to everybody else. But Ryan, thanks for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and thanks for the great questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the rest of you, I just want to say thank you for another episode of the Sports Ball Podcast. I do not do outros. I don't believe in them. Have a good night.